The wind bit at the rough-hewn logs of the cabin, a ceaseless, keening sound that promised only hardship. Sarah pulled the threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching her 5 sons huddle near the meager fire spitting weakly in the hearth. Their faces, thin and pale in the flickering light, were etched with the perpetual hunger that gnawed at them all. Winter had arrived early, a brutal fist slamming down on the plains, burying hope beneath drifts of snow. Each day was a struggle against the elements, against the gnawing fear of what tomorrow might bring. Since Thomas had been taken by the fever 2 months past, the world had shrunk to the confines of these walls, a fragile shell against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, whispering doubts about her ability to protect them, to keep them fed. They were isolated, miles from the nearest settlement, relying solely on their dwindling supplies and Sarah's desperate will. A sudden noise outside, a muffled cry carried on the wind, jerked her head up. Every sound was an alarm. She rose, moving quietly to the small, icy window. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Standing hunched against the side of the barn, half buried in a drift, was a man. Not one of the few trappers or prospectors who occasionally passed this way. He was a Native American, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion, clutching a bleeding wound in his side. His deerskin clothes were torn, inadequate against the bitter cold. Panic flared, primal and sharp. Tales of attacks, of violence, were the lullabies of the frontier. Her first instinct was to retreat, to bar the door, to protect her sons at all costs. But the man didn't look like a threat. He looked broken, desperate, on the verge of collapse. His eyes, when they met hers briefly across the snow-swept yard, held no menace, only suffering. A different kind of fear settled over her, the fear of turning away a fellow human being in such dire need, regardless of his lineage or the color of his skin. It was a different kind of risk, perhaps, but one that felt equally weighty in the silence of her conscience. Her eldest, 10-year-old William, peered at her, his eyes wide with unspoken questions. She looked back at the figure outside. The wind howled louder, whipping snow around him. He swayed, then sank slowly to his knees in the drift. He was injured, freezing, alone. The blanket and bread were luxuries they could ill afford to spare. Every scrap of food, every piece of fabric, was a precious resource in their fight for survival. To offer aid was to potentially weaken their own defenses, both against the elements and against unknown human dangers. Yet, to deny him, the image of her own sons, exposed and vulnerable, rose unbidden. What if they were ever in such a state? Would she pray for a hand of kindness? Taking a deep, shaky breath, Sarah made her choice. It felt less like a decision and more like a surrender to something fundamental. "William," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "fetch the thickest blanket from the chest. And some of the bread we baked yesterday." William's eyes widened further, a mixture of fear and bewilderment, but he nodded, obeying without question. She retrieved the blanket and the small loaf, her hands trembling. Opening the door was an act of profound vulnerability, a deliberate step across a boundary of fear and mistrust. The cold air rushed in, sharp and unforgiving. She stepped out onto the porch, holding the items out. The man looked up, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He didn't move towards her immediately. A tense silence hung between them, heavy with history and suspicion. Finally, slowly, he pushed himself up, wincing in pain, and shuffled towards her through the snow. He took the offerings with a brief, silent nod, his gaze intense, then pulled the blanket around his shoulders and tore a piece from the bread, raising it to his lips. He didn't speak, offered no thanks, simply accepted the gesture with a quiet dignity that transcended the moment's raw need. Sarah watched him, the wind tearing at her clothes, a profound sense of exposure washing over her. She had offered a lifeline, but to whom? And at what cost? She retreated inside, barring the door, the image of his pain-etched face and the stark reality of their shared, brutal world lingering long after the latch fell into place. The night felt longer, colder, and more uncertain than any before. The morning dawned gray and still, the wind having died down, replaced by an unnerving silence. Sarah woke with a knot of dread tightening in her gut. She went immediately to the window. The man was gone. Only a faint impression in the snow marked where he had knelt. Had he survived the night? Had he moved on? Or had he brought something worse? Her mind, already a battlefield of anxieties, conjured images of the stories told in hushed tones around distant campfires. She busied herself with the morning routine, trying to project a calm she didn't feel for the sake of her sons. But every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, set her teeth on edge. The quiet felt heavy, expectant, like the pause before a storm. William went out to check the trap lines near the woods, a duty he had taken on with quiet solemnity since his father's death. He returned sooner than usual, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mother," he whispered, his voice thin with terror. "Horses, many horses, coming this way." Sarah's blood ran cold. "How many, William?" He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on hers. "I couldn't count. So many. And men," he paused, his gaze flicking towards the forest edge. They're like the man from last night, but they have paint on their faces. And weapons." The world tilted. The act of kindness, the bread and blanket given in a moment of shared humanity, had not bought them safety. It had perhaps marked them. Or perhaps the man, despite his need, was part of a larger, inevitable force. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The lone figure, the injury, the sudden appearance of many. Had he been a scout? Had he been running from them? Or had he simply revealed their location by seeking aid? Just then, a shadow fell across the doorway. The Native American man from the night before stood on the porch, no longer hunched in pain, though he moved stiffly. His expression was grim, his eyes sharp and scanning the woods. He held a rifle he hadn't possessed last night. He looked directly at Sarah, and for the first time spoke. His voice was low, guttural. His words clipped and urgent in a language she didn't understand, but his meaning was horrifyingly clear. He gestured towards the approaching sounds, then back towards the cabin, his hand making a barricading motion, then pointing to the boys, his expression stern. He wasn't here to join the attack, he was here because of it. His presence, which had seemed a vulnerability the night before, now shifted, becoming something else entirely. A grim, unexpected protection. The trust she had tentatively extended was perhaps not misplaced in him, but profoundly complicated by the actions of his people. He pointed towards the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, then to her sons. "Hide them." His eyes met hers, a silent, intense communication passing between them. Fear warred with a dawning sense of purpose. This man, a stranger, potentially linked to the very people who were coming to destroy her life, was now preparing to stand with her. There was no time for questions, no room for doubt. Survival was the only imperative. "William, take your brothers," she commanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Into the cellar. Stay quiet. No matter what you hear, the boys," their faces reflecting her own fear but bolstered by her sudden resolve, scrambled towards the trapdoor. The man moved with a quiet efficiency, checking the rifle, barring the door with a heavy table, positioning himself near the window. He pointed to the small cache of weapons Thomas had kept: a hunting rifle, a pistol, powder, shot. Sarah moved to gather them, her mind clearing with adrenaline. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now a cold, sharp focus, not a paralyzing fog. She loaded the rifle, her hands fumbling slightly but finding the familiar rhythm Thomas had taught her. Beside her, the man from the snow, whose name she did not know, whose motives were tangled and complex, was preparing to face his own kind to protect strangers who had shown him a single act of mercy. The approaching thunder of hooves grew louder, the chilling war cries beginning to pierce the stillness. There were indeed many of them. The odds were impossible, but they would not go down without a fight. The noise outside swelled into a terrifying crescendo of hooves drumming against frozen earth, guttural war cries echoing across the clearing, and the splintering crack of wood. They were here. The man he had indicated his name was Kalen, with a series of gestures and sounds the night before. A small act of communication she now clung to was positioned by the main window, rifle raised. Sarah took up her own spot by the door, the heavy rifle feeling clumsy but solid in her grip. Below them, in the cramped darkness of the root cellar, she could hear her son's muffled whimpers. Her heart ached with a fierce, protective love, turning her fear into a hard, unyielding core of determination. She would not let them reach her children. The cabin door shuddered under a heavy blow. Kalen fired his rifle through the window opening. A cry of pain answered him. More thuds against the walls, arrows thudding into the logs. The air filled with the acrid smell of smoke as they began to torch the outbuildings. The barn, the symbol of their fragile self-sufficiency, went up in flames, casting an orange glow on the swirling snow. The light and heat seemed wrong, obscene, against the brutal cold. Sarah fired blindly through a crack next to the door frame, the kick of the rifle jarring her shoulder. She didn't know if she hit anything, but it was an act of defiance, a scream against the overwhelming violence. Kalen was firing with deadly accuracy, his movements economical and precise. He seemed to know exactly when and where to aim, his face a mask of grim concentration. He was a warrior, honed by a lifetime of struggle, now using his skills to protect the very people his kinsmen sought to harm. The irony was brutal, sharp as a knife. The attack was relentless, wave after wave. They tried the windows, the door, even the chimney. The small cabin, their sanctuary, became a desperate fortress. Sarah reloaded the rifle, her hands slick with sweat despite the cold, the powder and shot seeming pitifully few against the onslaught. Kalen moved from window to window, covering angles, his silent presence a source of strength. There was no dialogue between them, only shared action, shared terror, shared resolve. A look, a gesture was enough. When he was momentarily overwhelmed by attackers at the back window, Sarah instinctively moved to cover the front, firing to draw attention. When the door threatened to give way, he was instantly there, bracing it with his shoulder while she fired point-blank through a knothole. The hours stretched into an eternity. The sounds of battle were a constant, jarring symphony of destruction. Outside, the world was chaos and fire. Inside, it was a desperate, silent struggle for survival. Sarah saw figures silhouetted against the flames of the barn, heard the screams of men, both attackers and, she suspected, some brought down by Kalen's rifle. She saw the raw, brutal face of conflict, stripped of any pretense or romanticism. This was pure, desperate survival. At one point, Kalen was struck by an arrow in the shoulder. He staggered back with a grunt of pain, but with a grimace, broke off the shaft, leaving the head embedded. He bound it tightly with a strip of cloth torn from the curtain, his eyes never leaving the window. Sarah watched, a wave of nausea washing over her, quickly replaced by a renewed surge of fear. He was injured, their protector wounded, but he didn't falter. He resumed his position, favoring the other arm, his resolve unbroken. It was a display of resilience that shamed her own moments of near despair. Slowly, incredibly, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows, the intensity of the attack began to wane. The war cries became more distant, the sound of hooves receding. Were they regrouping? Were they leaving? A tense silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn and the pounding of her own heart. Kalen remained vigilant, rifle still raised, listening, watching. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of death. They waited, suspended in the brutal aftermath, unsure if the threat had passed or was merely pausing. The silence felt even heavier than the storm of noise before. They had survived the worst, but the cost was etched into the ravaged landscape and into their very souls. The night, if it came, would be long and fraught with uncertainty. The silence that followed the retreat was vast, heavy, and absolute. It pressed in on the cabin, broken only by the dying embers of the barn and the ragged breathing of Sarah and Kaelin. Below them, the sons were quiet, hopefully asleep, spared the full horror of what had transpired above. Sarah lowered her rifle, her arms aching, her body trembling with exhaustion and the receding tide of adrenaline. Kaelin still stood by the window, watching the dark perimeter, his injured shoulder slumped slightly. The scale of the attack had been immense, terrifyingly so. That they had survived it all felt like a miracle, one born not of luck, but of desperate, unified resistance. Slowly, carefully, Sarah moved to the cellar trapdoor and opened it. "It's over," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You can come out now, one by one." Her sons emerged into the dim light, their faces smudged with dirt and tears, their eyes wide with the lingering fear. She pulled them close, burying her face in their hair, a wave of profound relief washing over her, so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. They were alive. She looked at Kaelin. He turned from the window, his gaze meeting hers. There was no triumph in his eyes, only weariness and a deep, shared understanding of the brutality they had just faced together. The man she had offered a blanket and bread to less than 2 days ago had just helped her defend her home against his own people. The act of simple kindness had unintended, complex consequences. He had been caught between his world and hers, and in that crucible of violence, a bond had been forged, silent and unbreakable. He gestured towards the horizon, then back towards his wound. His meaning was clear. He had to leave. Staying here now was a danger to both of them. His presence had drawn the attack. His survival might draw more. But before he left, he looked at her. A long, steady look that held gratitude, regret, and a quiet acknowledgement of the debt paid in blood and fire. He had arrived seeking aid. He left having given protection beyond measure. He had facilitated her survival, forcing her to find a strength she never knew she possessed. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. There were no farewells needed, no words sufficient for the shared ordeal. He had arrived a stranger, a potential threat in the common narrative, but had become an unexpected ally, his humanity revealed in action, not words. He melted back into the darkness, a silent figure against the scarred landscape. Left alone with her sons amongst the ruins of their outbuildings, Sarah surveyed the damage. The cabin stood, battered but unbroken. The barn was gone. The world felt smaller, harsher, yet oddly, she felt larger within it. The terror had not destroyed her. It had refined her. The vulnerable woman who had lived in fear had faced down a nightmare and survived. She had discovered resilience not in the absence of fear, but in acting despite it. The path ahead was uncertain. They were alone, winter was deepening, and the threat might return. But she looked at her sons, then at the horizon where Kaelin had disappeared, and a quiet strength settled within her. Kindness could be complicated, trust hard-won, and the world was undeniably cruel. Yet, in the heart of the storm, a connection had been made, a fundamental humanity acknowledged across a chasm of fear and conflict. She had offered bread, received protection, and in the process, found the steel in her own soul. They would rebuild. They would endure. The dawn, though cold, held the promise of a new day, one step at a time, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit against overwhelming odds.